of the questions during the Q&A, but if any are not answered, we'll be sure to follow up via email after the webinar. And then lastly, the presentations and the entire webinar is being recorded, so we will be sure to send out the webinar recording to all registered participants, or the link to the recording. So now I'm just going to start off by providing a short introduction to ACR. One more time. ACR is part of Winrock International. Winrock is a nonprofit organization that was formed in 1985 by 3 Rockefeller family organizations. Winrock is dedicated to economic development and resource management in the United States and around the world. And the organization places a strong emphasis on climate change impacts, adaptation, and environmental markets. ACR was the first private voluntary greenhouse gas registry, and it was founded in 1996, and it then became part of Winrock in 2007. ACR's activities include developing and approving carbon offset methodologies and standards, overseeing project verifications, and reviewing and registering offset projects, including issuing and retiring serialized offsets. In December 2012, ACR was approved by the Air Resources Board of California as an offset project registry, and then ACR opened an office in Sacramento, California in May 2012. ACR works in both the voluntary and the California compliance markets, and there are key differences between these markets. For example, buyers in the voluntary carbon market are corporations or governments or individuals that voluntarily purchase and retire offsets. Voluntary carbon prices are typically less transparent and tend to vary widely. In contrast, buyers in the California compliance offsets market are known entities who purchase offsets to meet their emission reduction obligations. Further, demand for offsets and pricing are often more predictable and transparent in the California offset market. And all California compliance offset projects must register with an approved offset project registry such as ACR. So this is a list of ACR's approved agriculture and land use methodologies. There are 8 approved methodologies and 2 more in progress. If anyone has questions about any of these, please make sure to contact us after the webinar. Next slide, please. And of these methodologies, I just wanted to highlight two wetland methodologies. The first methodology here, which is the restoration of degraded deltaic wetlands of the Mississippi Delta, was developed by the same team that is speaking here at this webinar, and I think they're going to talk quite a bit more about that later in the program. We also have a methodology being developed for California wetland restoration, which will be submitted to ACR for approval sometime this spring. Next slide, please. So with that, I will conclude my presentation, and I want to thank you all. We'll now switch over to Sarah from Tierra Resources. Over to you, Sarah.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us today. We are super grateful for all the interest in this webinar, and we're surprised how many global registrants from other countries are participating today. Dick Kempta from the Climate Trust sends his regrets that he can't be with us. But Dr. Rob Lane and I are going to present today, and then again we have John Day, who will be available for questions. Oops, sorry, I'm having a little bit of an issue with moving the slides. Okay. So to start out, just to give a little bit of background on Tierra Resources, our mission is to conserve, protect, and restore coastal wetland ecosystems by creating innovative solutions that support investment into blue carbon. We were founded in 2007 and are now considered the nationally recognized innovator and quality leader in the research, development, and monetization of blue carbon. So the Climate Trust, their mission is transforming the economy to value our climate. They're a nonprofit that began in 1997, and their specialty is really carbon asset management. They've managed over 20 million of carbon funding and have a lot of interest in land-based offsets such as forestry, agriculture, grasslands, and wetlands. They've transacted more than 2.2 million tons of greenhouse gases and also work in both the compliance and the voluntary programs. So just to give a quick overview of our webinar today, I know we have a broad spectrum of participants, so I thought I would start out with some background and then dive into the actual study. We also wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. So today we will really be talking about blue carbon. So really what we are talking about is photosynthesis. All plants take carbon dioxide out of the air, and the carbon in the carbon dioxide is stored in the plant. Now, wetlands are unique in that they also store carbon in the soil. So really, with blue carbon, we are referring to tidally influenced ecosystems, such as mangroves, seagrasses, and coastal wetlands. And in Louisiana, we also have tidally influenced cypress blooms. Now, Jessica already gave a bit of a review of emissions tradings and these types of markets. So I'll just touch on this very quickly, that there's really two types of markets. There's the voluntary market, which really three exist right now in the United States with ACR, VCS, and CAR, as well as compliance markets where most of the focus is on California right now. So really when we're talking about these markets, you hear about carbon credits, but we usually refer to these as offsets, which represent 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. So an offset really, how it works is it's a reduction, avoidance, or removal of 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, since there's many greenhouse gases, resulting from a specific project activity, and it's used to compensate for an equivalent emission occurring somewhere else. So in compliance programs, an offset comes from sectors that are not bound by that regulatory requirement. So for example, if there was a refinery in California, they could probably look at the facility first and try to figure out ways to reduce their greenhouse gases. And after that, they would look at other programs that they could invest into or projects that could reduce emissions for them. Now, a protocol or a methodology is basically a rigorous scientific framework for project development, and it becomes the foundation for third-party validation and verification in order to ensure the quality of these credits. Now, previously there was no wetland methodology in these markets to transact wetland carbon. But sponsored by Entergy in 2012, Sierra Resources introduced the very first wetland carbon offset methodology. And our co-authors, Dr. Rob Lane and John Day, are actually on the line today. So this was through the American Carbon Registry, sponsored by Entergy, and it was what actually introduced wetland restoration to these markets. Now, our methodology, which really focuses on Louisiana, has a certain eligibility. So that's up to 4 million acres of wetlands, and primarily what we're talking about is the coastal zone of Louisiana. However, it does extend into small parts of Mississippi and Texas. So our next step, besides kicking off the first pilot project with Entergy, was really to evaluate the commercial potential of blue carbon in Louisiana. So our first step was really to determine landowner interest in project participation. We met with landowners who collectively own over 2.3 million acres in approximately 4 million acres of eligibility area. And really, the landowners overwhelmingly expressed interest in being able to explore wetland carbon project participation. So these efforts really demonstrate that there's substantial interest among landowners, and it provides a strong foundation for future carbon project development. After that, we really needed to be able to identify scalable restoration methods that show commercialization potential as wetland offset projects, to determine the carbon impacts of incorporating prevented wetland loss into carbon accounting, determine what Louisiana's offset supply could be, and what those financial estimates are associated with that blue carbon. We also recognize the importance of expanding the wetland offset sector to other regions and wanted to identify information needs that could help expand this project type. So these were really the overall goals of the study. From here, I'm going to hand this over to Rob Lane to handle the carbon modeling.
All right, thank you, Sarah. You can hear me okay, I take it.
Yeah.
So the main goals or objectives of these projects are the restoration of hydrology, vegetation, and wetland functions to sites where wetlands are degraded or were previously present and are absent now. We reviewed the restoration techniques in the Louisiana Comprehensive Master Plan for Sustainable Coast that came out a year or two ago, and we researched additional restoration techniques not included in the restoration plan, such as wetland assimilation and mangrove plantings. I'll get into these techniques in a moment. Next slide. These restoration techniques were then analyzed for commercial wetland offset potential, looking at the long-term enhancement of wetlands, that is the increased growth due to the project, as well as prevention of wetland loss, and we'll get into what that means in a moment. And as Sarah mentioned, we looked at the scalability of the project and the cost effectiveness. Next slide, please. So the restoration techniques that we're looked at are river diversions and hydrologic restoration. River diversions are the input of river water into wetlands by breaching the levee, either by going over it with siphons or through using diversion structures. And hydrologic restoration, which includes the removal of weirs and levees to allow water and nutrient and sediment exchange to occur in wetlands that are now impounded and degrading. Marsh creation involves the transport of dredged sediments to both wetlands. This is a very energy-intensive means of building wetlands. And wetland assimilation, which is the introduction of nutrified water into wetlands, usually forested wetlands, for water quality improvement as well as increased growth in the wetland. And mangrove plantings, and this is done along the coast in areas that do not receive natural propagals due to propagal limitation. Propagal limitation can be caused by barriers to propagals going into an area. So if you plant in areas where you have propagal limitation, you can count those credits towards those carbon sequestration toward credits. Next slide, please. So our carbon pools that we're looking at for forested wetlands, or that we included, are trees, the above ground biomass of trees, the below ground biomass of trees using the root-shoot ratio, or alternatively, looking at the soil horizon using cores. The pools that we omitted include leaf litter and dead wood, which are eventually incorporated into the soil matrix, and so we conservatively omitted those since we'll be double counting to keep them in. For emerging wetlands, we just look at the soil horizon, emitting above ground biomass, since that is also incorporated into the below ground biomass. And our emission sources, we included methane and nitrous oxide, and omitted carbon dioxide. Next slide. So for all these projects, the key equation is that a carbon offset is the difference between the carbon sequestered in your project versus your baseline. And the schematic here shows the idea of your increased growth from the project, and that increased growth is what you can count as carbon credits. And in the equation below, it also shows that we take into account leakage, which is the LK there, and uncertainty, which is the UNC in the equation. Next slide. I think we do it two there. Okay, so we developed a database. Excuse me. We developed a database of carbon sequestration rates from Mississippi River Delta wetlands, and we based it completely on peer-reviewed scientific literature, which is in the table below. Marsh creation was limited from the analysis due to concerns about permanence of the wetlands because they sink and they're not sustainable, as well as fossil fuel emissions during dredging, which are astronomical. The hydrological restoration and divergence were combined since they're sort of very similar to each other. And none of the projects had increased greenhouse gas emissions beyond what occurred in the baseline scenario for any of these projects. That is also included in this analysis here. So if we look at the baseline, first column, the baseline sequestration, we can see that for forested wetlands, we have the same number, which is 4.7, and that's our baseline value of metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per acre per year for forested wetlands versus freshwater emergent wetlands, which is 3.2, and our saltwater wetland is 3.8. So that's what we expect on baseline conditions as business as usual. With the projects, the hydro diversions or the hydro restoration and diversion projects, we're adding water and nutrients into a system, and we go from sequestering 4.7 metric tons of carbon per year to 8.5 with a net offset of 3.8 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. And most of that's tied up into trees, because when we take the trees out, it's this emergent wetland, we get 0.8, and that's due to absence of trees, just like decrease. For wetland assimilation, has the highest sequestration potential of any of the techniques, with an increase of 7 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year per acre. And for forested wetlands and for emergent wetlands, it comes down to 3.1. And for mangrove planting, it's approximately 2 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. Next slide. Unfortunately, many wetlands in Louisiana are deteriorating, resulting in potential release of large amounts of previously stored carbon from the anaerobic decomposition of organic matter. There is potential for this carbon to be claimed as carbon offsets if restoration efforts are successful in preventing the loss of the wetland soil horizon. Next slide. The top 50 centimeters of the wetland soil horizon generally includes a living root zone, which is most susceptible to decomposition when vegetation dies. And based on values derived from the scientific literature, the top 50 centimeters of the wetland soil horizon contains approximately 206 metric tons of carbon per acre. We currently have a study underway to determine the proportion of the root zone that is released as greenhouse gases when vegetation dies in freshwater, brackish and saltwater wetlands. However, the data isn't being analyzed. The data is still to be analyzed. So for this presentation here, we calculated various scenarios of 25, 50, and 75% of the carbon contained in the root zone as being released as greenhouse gases to estimate the potential of carbon offsets from prevented loss. I think Sarah is going to go on to the next set of calculations. You there, Sarah? There.
Yeah. Okay, great. So next what we wanted to look at after we had the sequestration rates per acre was what the potential offset volume would be coming from these restoration techniques. So again, what we ended up doing is we ended up working with the Louisiana Coastal Master Plan for a Sustainable Coast. For those of you who are not familiar with this document, it was a highly vetted scientific plan that took several years for Louisiana to put in place that looked at various types of restoration and various different types of scenarios. So we used that as a basis for determining our restoration acreage. And then there were some restoration techniques that are not currently included in the plan, such as mangrove plantings and wetland assimilation. So for those type of wetland restoration techniques, we actually did our own modeling in order to determine what the potential acreage was. So once we had the acreage, what we also did was we decided to take a 20% buffer deduction. So for those of you who are not familiar with what a buffer is it basically acts as a self-insurance program to guard against any kind of risk in the project. Now the minimum buffer deduction you can take is 10%, and it can go even greater than 50%. But after having done some of these risk assessments on our own projects, 20% seemed like a good figure that we could work with and apply to all of this restoration. Even though normally you would apply a buffer deduction, the risk analysis would be specific to one project. But to simplify, we took a 20% buffer deduction on all of the rates and then applied them towards the various acreages. What we then did was we applied it by a 50-year project length. Now, this corresponds with the Louisiana Coastal Master Plan as far as what they actually modeled in their master plan. So we wanted to take note that in our actual methodology, it's a 40-year crediting period and a 40-year project life. So coastal wetland restoration in Louisiana has the potential to produce over 1.8 million offsets per year and almost 92 million offsets over 50 years. So as Rob noted, forested wetland assimilation systems have the highest net offset yield per acre. However, it was concluded that river diversions and mangrove plantings have the potential to generate the largest volume of offsets in Louisiana due to the large amount of acreage that these restoration techniques can be applied. We also wanted to note that carbon credits from wetland assimilation systems and river diversions show potential to be stacked with water quality credits should these markets evolve in Louisiana. So next, what we wanted to look at was the prevented wetland loss offset value. So in the Louisiana Coastal Master Plan, they had two scenarios, a high and a low value for each environmental uncertainty. And they named their scenarios a moderate scenario and a less optimistic scenario. So for understandability and better reading, we changed those names to a low loss rate and a high loss rate. Now, the Master Plan for Sustainable Coast also evaluated river diversions and other restoration techniques to maximize land building over 50 years. So the results indicated that approximately 620 square miles in the low loss rate scenario and approximately 1,100 square miles in the high loss rate scenario would be prevented from converting to open water. So assuming that 25 to 75% of the carbon in the top 50 centimeters of sediment could be prevented from re-releasing those greenhouse gases, those results range from 20 million offsets to 100 million offsets over 50 years. And that's before the buffer deduction. So what we did for the purposes of this study is we ended up assuming that 50% of the carbon stored in the top 50 centimeters of soil is released as carbon dioxide. And if these prevented emissions could qualify as offsets, they could produce an additional 32.8 million offsets in the low loss rate to over 58.1 million offsets in the high loss rate scenario over a 50-year time frame. So basically, this image portrays the substantial offset volume potential and highlights the importance of incorporating the prevention of wetland loss into carbon accounting methodologies. Now, our next aspect was to look at the actual financial implications of this. So what we did was we looked at two price scenarios. We looked at one, which was a low price scenario of around $4.40 an offset, and that was the average historical price for ACR voluntary offsets at the time when we were doing this modeling. We also looked at a high price scenario of $10.80 an offset, and so that was more to kind of simulate potentially being in the California compliance offset market or a high voluntary price, since wetlands are such charismatic projects. And so if all the potential restoration projects were undertaken, it ranges from $8 million per year under the low price scenario to over $19.8 million per year if the higher offset price is achieved. These values include the 20% buffer contribution, and the acreage are according to over 50 years that are modeled in the Louisiana Comprehensive Master Plan. Now, assuming that the crediting period for the carbon project could be extended and carbon offset yields are steady over the 50-year period, potential offset revenues could total about $400 million under the low price scenario to almost $1 billion if the higher offset price is achieved. Now, including the prevented wetland loss in there, it would be an additional $140 million under the low loss rate and the low price to nearly $630 million in the high loss rate, higher price over a 50-year time frame. So overall, carbon finance has the potential to bring a total of $540 million to almost $1.6 billion to coastal restoration in Louisiana. Now there's many factors. That's obviously a large range in funding. So there's many factors that could influence this funding. So one of the biggest ones is the price of the carbon offset. Another secondary one is the inclusion of wetlands in California's compliance market, since that would increase the price of the carbon offset. Incorporating prevented wetland loss in carbon accounting would also really influence this funding. And largely, the amount of wetlands that can successfully be restored for the project life is very important. The project life for our methodology is considered 40 years. In the California compliance market, the project life can be up to 100 years. Another big aspect that we will also talk about is that some of what could influence this funding are the eligibility rules, such as start date, easement type, use of federal funds is a big one, and also the requirements on those buffer deductions. So really the biggest challenge that we found is really the high cost of wetland restoration. When you're talking about a lot of the other traditional land-based offsets, a lot of them are a lot less expensive than restoring a wetland restoration project. So what we found is that the cost of restoration could exceed carbon revenues. And this will require that carbon finance will need to be leveraged with traditional restoration programs. Now, some restoration techniques may be able to be fully funded through carbon, but many will have to be leveraged with traditional restoration programs. So an example would be for a public-private paradigm to be developed and to use some of these carbon funds to match other types of funding. So an example would be lots of the restoration programs don't pay for the long-term monitoring and maintenance of restoration projects that carbon could potentially address. Also, local cost shares can be required out of restoration programs that carbon might be able to address. Or it could be that a government restoration program does a certain aspect of the project, and then landowners would come in, for example, and do plantings once the conditions are right and be responsible for that aspect and pay for that with carbon. So those are some examples. Some of the technical recommendations that we had on this project was really one of the biggest one is to try to reduce project development costs and simplify the monitoring, reporting, and verification. There needs to be further research to justify the exclusion of greenhouse gas emissions or develop regional greenhouse gas emission factors. Now in Louisiana, as Rob noted, when we did our big peer-reviewed modeling exercise, in most of the situations, the baseline emissions were actually higher than the restoration emissions. So in the case of Louisiana, there's a justification to exclude greenhouse gas emissions that might be different in different regions. But the ability to develop regional greenhouse gas emission factors that could be used in place of very cost-intensive monitoring would greatly help to open up this offset sector. Another suggestion, very relevant to Louisiana, is to be able to modify Louisiana's coastal reference monitoring system, which is a huge monitoring program, to be able to include some of the carbon offset monitoring parameters, again, to reduce some of the cost of monitoring. Models would also really help to reduce costs of project development, such as wetland carbon and greenhouse gas emission models. And lastly, having a database for wetland management information would also help to decrease costs. One of our other big takeaways was to quantify the carbon benefit of prevented loss. So there needs to be further research on the carbon impacts of preventing wetland loss. ConocoPhillips is currently working with Sierra Resources on a study addressing some of these aspects that will be released at some point in 2015. But there's definitely some room for further research in this area to really quantify what happens to the previously stored carbon as the wetland erodes and converts to open water. It's also important to incorporate this into carbon accounting. So actually, our methodology with the American Carbon Registry is currently in a revision to better account for this prevented wetland loss. Other methodologies may want to look at this as well. Also, publishing lessons learned from existing pilots would be really helpful for the general population, with analyses of costs and benefits, as well as examples of public-private paradigms that really demonstrate the ability to leverage carbon finance with government restoration dollars. Now, our policy recommendations, one of the biggest ones is to be able to advocate with carbon standards. And one of the biggest ones is really to allow the use of federal funds. The costs of wetland restoration are so much higher than most of these other projects that we really need to be able to leverage traditional restoration funding with carbon finance. So that's probably one of the most important. There also needs to be some advocacy around environmental credit stacking. A lot of the coastal restoration projects show potential to be stacked with water quality or nutrient credits. Other aspects that could use advocacy are the eligible types of conservation easements, rules and processes for project aggregation, and the crediting period for wetland restoration. Another big aspect would be establishing funding pools, and this would allow wetland project development to scale up and meet future carbon demands in the compliance market. Now, there's obviously a big focus on California right now, and other wetland protocols are being developed. So this includes the ACR California methodology, which I believe will be entering into the national public comment period soon. There's also a global tidal wetlands methodology that's currently in the certification process, as well as a marsh creation methodology that's focused again in Louisiana that was certified earlier last year. So there does show potential that we could modify these wetland methodologies to allow for inclusion of wetlands in California's compliance market. And this would allow for a sustained demand for these offset credits and also guarantee higher offset prices. Now, final conclusions really are that the recent developments show growing recognition of wetlands' role in climate change mitigation. There is a significant offset supply in Louisiana that can be expanded not only to California but to other regions as well as other areas throughout the world, and that there's substantial potential to generate important revenue to support wetland restoration. And we believe that the next biggest steps are really implementing those new public-private paradigms and transacting the first wetland carbon credits, which we intend to transact the first wetland carbon credits out of our pooling pilot project later on this year. So lastly, just to conclude, this work is really very personal to us. And leading up to the 10-year anniversary of Katrina, I really had to end with this image from my past life as one of the emergency managers during Katrina. And it really portrays the proximity of degraded wetlands to the city of New Orleans and just how vulnerable we are and how important it is to get this into the market. So lastly, we really just wanted to acknowledge both TR Resources and the Climate Trust are super grateful for Entergy's support of this project, as well as the methodology and the pilot project that they sponsored earlier. And with that, I think we're going to open it up to questions. And if there's any questions that don't get addressed during this webinar, please feel free to reach out to our website. Our email address is there, as well as our phone number if there's any questions that are not addressed.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Sarah. That was a great presentation. Also, thank you to Jessica and Rob for their parts of the presentation as well. My name is Stuart McMorrow. I work for ACR in the forestry program. However, today I'll be reading out some of the questions for our panelists to answer. We're going to leave this as somewhat of an open forum. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and read some of the questions that we now have. And we are going to allow the panelists to just choose amongst themselves who answers the question. So starting with the very first question, Rob, you may have already answered this, is can you just define what wetland assimilation is again, please?
I believe that John would like to answer this.
Okay.
Wetland assimilation is the removal of nutrients from secondarily treated municipal effluent by wetlands, and it also normally results in enhanced productivity and carbon uptake by the wetland plants.
Okay. Thank you, John. The next question, this may be for Jessica and Sarah, is over what time period does the average historical ACR voluntary offset price assume? And that is going back to that portion in your presentation, Sarah, where you had mentioned the price of, I think, $4.40 for an ACR offset price.
Sure, and I don't know if Jessica is better to answer this or not, but we did the financial modeling, I would say, almost a year ago, and at the time that was the average historical price for American Carbon Registry carbon offsets. Now, what's different in the voluntary market is that the price of the offsets are really very specific to each individual project, and a lot of that has to do with the charisma and appeal of the project itself. So we think that wetland restoration projects will get a higher value in the voluntary market because of the co-benefits such as storm surge protection and fisheries and some of that levels. But the voluntary market can really, it can fluctuate on the price for those credits. And about a year ago when we did this financial modeling, that was the average price out of the American Carbon Registry.
Okay, thanks. Next question is, what does global tidal methodology mean?
Sure, I can address that. I probably didn't put the right title in there, but I know that there is a global methodology through VCS that is in the certification process, and it's looking at tidal wetlands. But it has not really made it into a national public comment period yet where we've been able to look at it, so I don't have a whole lot more information on that methodology. I just know that it's in the certification process right now.
Okay, thanks. Next question is, where do things stand with the California Air Resource Board approving blue carbon offsets? What is the timing?
Do you want me to go ahead and try to address that?
Well,
yeah, it's kind of a tricky one. So obviously it's trying to look into a crystal ball. We hope to meet with the ARB on this later on this year. But my guess is we are probably, I would guess, maybe 2 to 3 years out. But we hope that they will consider wetlands in their compliance market. So far, there's no official word that they are doing so.
okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would, this is Jessica, I would add a similar sentiment. It's very difficult to speak for ARB, but based on discussions we've had with them to date, they have expressed interest in wetland carbon. They're interested in California wetlands and also linking with other states and obviously Mississippi and Louisiana, Mississippi coast and Louisiana coast would be the obvious linkage. So I think that there is definite interest, but the timing is very unknown, I think, at this point.
Okay, thanks, you guys. Next question is, when do you expect blue carbon to start contributing to coastal wetlands?
Sure. So as an actual funding mechanism, I kind of mentioned at the very end of our presentation that we intend to transact the first wetland carbon credits later on this year. So we have a pilot project that Entergy sponsored later on in 2012 when we first came out with our methodology. That is a wetland assimilation system that's about 1,200 acres. So we are hoping to transact those credits first, and I think as we start to transact credits, I think this market will start to open up more and you'll start seeing other wetland carbon credits. I would say the next key as well is just trying to expand the wetland offset sector by looking at other regions and developing methodologies or expanding our current methodology to other regions.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Next question. Why do you think money is sensitive to buffer if most of the risks are considered in the calculation of the buffer? Can you please describe an example or elaborate more on that?
Can you repeat that question one more time?
You bet. Why do you think money or funding is sensitive to the buffer if most of the risks are considered in the calculation of the buffer?
Maybe that would be a good question for ACR to explain exactly how these buffers work.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to explain. Currently, the way a buffer is calculated, there are basically default risks. I don't have them in front of me, but they apply to different kinds of risks that would result in reversals. And so, you know, that is determined and reevaluated at each verification. And so as you know, as risks are increase or decrease over time, that can change. As Sarah said, it can go as low as 10% and as high as 50%. I will also add that we are currently, ACR is currently working on a new risk tool, and that range will probably go a little bit down a little bit in the future. Not sure if that answers the question directly, but.
Yeah, and I can also try to address it a little bit more as well. As far as on our Luling pilot, when we did our risk assessment, we looked at various aspects. So natural risks, and what would happen if we had a fire or if we had a hurricane. And then we look at financial risk. Is the project already funded, or is there risk that funding would fall through? Are there any disputes over land ownership? What would happen if the landowner were to pull out? Those were all the types of risks that you tend to look at in a buffer. And I'm sure that there's more than just that, but hopefully that helps to address that question.
Okay, thanks, you guys. I think this next question can be directed to both Jessica and Sarah. And the question is, do California's care if credits come from Louisiana? So kind of a question about the location of the generation of carbon credits being applicable to, I'm guessing, the California Cap and Trade Program.
I mean, I can take a stab. Currently, the offset program of the California Cap and Trade Program allows offsets to come from anywhere in the lower 48 states. And for example, for the Forestry Protocol now, portions of Alaska are going to be included. So simple answer would be that Louisiana would certainly be eligible to generate offsets for that program.
And to expand a little further on that, Louisiana has a huge potential for wetland carbon offsets, most likely the highest out of any state, just because of the sheer acreage of wetlands that can be restored in this region. So if California were to consider opening up wetland carbon offsets, and because of their shortage in offset supply, they would very likely want to see Louisiana included in their market.
Okay, thanks. Next question. What are the biggest hurdles to getting pilot projects going? And as a follow-up, is there a way the federal government can facilitate pilot projects?
Sure, I would say in all of this, one of the biggest challenges is, well, first, the biggest challenge was having an approved methodology, which the methodology itself took us 5 years to fully write and get certified. And then after that, with the pilot projects, assuming that there's a methodology in place that allows for transaction in your region, it's always hard to just get the funding in place. And these projects at this point in time are very monitoring intensive, so that we hope over time, both by developing, for example, greenhouse gas emission factors, or at least in specific to Louisiana, being able to exclude greenhouse gases since restoration doesn't increase those gases. There's ways to reduce those monitoring over time and also develop models, that would also really help. And then I would say the next key issue is finding the right partners for these pilot projects and the right relationships with landowners, and really starting to create those public-private paradigms that leverage the different types of funding. And then, of course, just the sheer cost of wetland restoration is, for example, a lot more expensive than not cutting down a forest or preserving a prairie.
Okay, thank you. Has carbon funding been part of any Army Corps permitted mitigation wetlands yet? I think I read that correct. Has carbon funding been part of any Army Corps permitted wetland mitigation, I think, is the question.
Sure, I can address that because this question comes up a lot, and it's kind of a sticky area. So just to make sure that it's very clear, carbon offset projects are different than mitigation projects. And mitigation projects are not eligible for carbon offsets. So a mitigation bank or a mitigation project, it's really already compensating for wetland damages. So I can't justify that I am reducing emissions, for example, from a greenhouse gas, from an oil refinery, if I'm using a mitigation bank that's already compensating for lost wetlands. So there has been no, the Army Corps has not had any carbon funds with mitigation banks because mitigation banks are not eligible for carbon funding.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. We're getting quite a few questions here, so please be patient, everybody, as we move through these. Here's the next question. I'm not sure exactly who should get this one, but what do you think about mangrove restoration jointly implemented with aquaculture production systems such as silvofisheries systems? And I can reread that one if you need.
This is John. I can answer that. Normally, aquaculture systems, very active aquaculture systems, they put a lot of feed into the ponds, and the ponds then discharge fairly poor water quality water into estuarine waters. So if these waters could be discharged into mangroves, they would enhance mangrove growth rates and therefore carbon sequestration. So you could have an integration, but the mangroves couldn't grow in the ponds themselves.
Okay, thank you, John. I think we're getting some follow-up questions, some of our answers here as well, but I'll carry on with reading these new ones for now. This question asks, can the modeling that was done be used for neighboring states if they have the same wetland type? Or will they have to develop their own standard models with defaults?
Are they referring to, I'm assuming they're referring to the database that we developed, which is pretty specific to Louisiana diathetic wetlands, but can be extrapolated to other wetlands that are formed by riverine input and are nutrient-rich, nutrient-rich systems versus nutrient-poor systems like the Everglades. It wouldn't be extrapolated to the Everglades, would not be appropriate. But for some other wetlands, it could be justified. Say the wetlands outside Mobile, Alabama, could be justified.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Another question from the same asker. Has there been any financial comparison or benefit analysis of traditional mitigation banking versus carbon crediting for restoration?
I wouldn't say that there's been super in-depth studies, but in general right now, because of the lower prices of carbon, the price for mitigation banks is much higher than a price for a carbon credit.
Okay. Next question is a little bit long. I'll reread it if you guys ask here. I'll try and go slow. Has anyone considered the planting of coconut trees along the beaches of the barrier island beachheads, which often protect the marshes? These beachheads protect the marshes from the pounding of the surf. Protecting beachheads will protect marshland wetlands. coconut tree planting has a multifaceted benefit, and they've listed several benefits there. The main question, has anyone considered the planting of coconut trees along these beaches of the barrier islands?
John, I don't know if
I
you'd
would
be
think that there's a
better-
reason that we don't. I'm not sure if there would be coconuts would survive in Louisiana on those beaches. They're, I think it might be the frost line might be too high.
Okay. Any other answers from the group?
Well, this is John. As far as I know, nobody has looked at that.
Okay. I will go on to the next question. If that person that asked that question wants to ask a follow-up question, please feel free. The next question we have here is, how did you do the assessment that led to the conclusion that Louisiana restoration doesn't increase greenhouse gas emissions? Do you think a similar process could be used in other parts of the country?
We came about that through looking at the literature values for greenhouse gas emissions from various types of wetlands, including wetlands receiving the restoration techniques that we cited. And so that's simply what we did. We looked at the literature, and in almost every case, the project scenario had less greenhouse gas emissions than the baseline. So that's how we came up with that.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Next question here is, what are the true costs for wetland assimilation per acre? And how does it compare with value that might be received from the sale of carbon offsets? I.e., what is the scale of the monetary deficit?
Yeah, that's a tricky question, and that's what we are starting to address right now through our pilot projects. And I think what will be interesting as these projects evolve is that each project will be looked at individually. So, for example, for our assimilation pilot project that we're getting ready to transact, the situation behind that project was this was located in St. Charles Parish, and that parish is in the coastal zone. It's been hit by numerous federal disaster grade hurricanes. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to continue to have an oxidation pond and then build a distribution system out to wetlands. And the reason why they like their oxidation pond is when they're hit by a hurricane, you can put that system back online really quickly. So the parish had the funding for the actual infrastructure of the distribution system. What they lacked was funding to compensate the landowner for the 1,200 acres they would be using where it gets discharged. So with that project, what happened was they went ahead and entered into an agreement with the landowner that they would compensate for the landowner through carbon credits. And if for some reason that wouldn't be successful, then they would have to compensate the landowner financially, which would result in increased rates for that community. So the goal of that project is that the carbon credits will compensate the landowner. It in turn lets the parish pursue more sustainable infrastructure that's more hurricane resilient without increasing their rates. Now we have another project that is a feasibility study sponsored by Shell, more towards the Maurepas area. And in that project, the infrastructure is not currently funded. It's actually nominated right now for potential Restore Act funds. So for that project, we would be looking for carbon to potentially pay for the infrastructure, which for sure, that infrastructure for that system is about 1.5 to 1.7 million. So we're in the midst doing some financial modeling on that project, but that project would need to be leveraged with some kind of other traditional funds. And so that's where we'll see these projects evolve on. They will be very case specific and will probably involve multiple parties, and that's where these new paradigms will have to come out, where it becomes a win-win situation for all the parties involved, because without that, the projects won't be successful.
I'd also like to add, oh, okay, go on, sir, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, you can.
I'd like to add that the cost-benefit analysis for assimilation, using wetlands to treat water rather than using conventional treatment technologies, it's about an order of magnitude. So you spend about an order of magnitude less using wetlands to treat your water than you would using a conventional treatment plant. And so that's the benefit of using wetland assimilation.
And just to clarify further, when we're working on these wetland assimilation projects, because I know they're not throughout the world, we're talking about discharging secondarily treated effluent. So what the wetland system does is it removes the nutrients. But otherwise, the wetland's been treated, the wastewater's been treated and disinfected.
It would normally be discharged into the surrounding rivers and streams, but rather than dumping it into the river, we put it through wetlands first.
Okay, thanks, you guys. It looks like we only have one last question here, and it came in with a comment. So let me ask the question, and I hope that you guys will understand the question. And if not, perhaps the person that asked the question can rephrase it. The question is, how has the, quote, changing course project results for restoration of the delta been incorporated?
The question refers to an effort, a design competition that's ongoing in Louisiana now to ask these teams to look at the potential for removing navigation from the current mouth of the Mississippi River and put it in a separate channel so that the river could be fully used for coastal restoration. And no, wetland assimilation was not considered in that, but it certainly could be.
Yeah, this project didn't consider the changing course at all. Really, we looked at the restoration techniques that are included in the state master plan, as well as looking at wetland assimilation and mangrove plantings that also show significant potential.
Okay, thank you. It looks like we have one last question or comment. I'm reading it as it came in, so pardon me here. But here goes. I own an undivided interest in the two barrier islands just east of Grand Isle, and I am aware that the climate of the Louisiana barrier islands is marginally suitable for coconut production. Coastal beautification needs to go hand in hand with coastal protection so as to gain public and industrial support. So I guess not a question, a comment. I don't know if you guys want to have any, want to take that discussion offline, or if you guys want to add any commentary to that at this point.
Again, I would question the viability of coconuts and coconut trees in Louisiana.
I would just add that it could be a subject for further research and discussion.
And yeah, whoever this landowner is, they're welcome to contact us, and we can give them some advice on their property.
Okay. I think it's, we don't have any more questions at this point, so I think that's a good segue into directing everybody to the email address and the phone number and the web address for Tierra Resources shown on the screen here. So at this point, unless the panelists have any closing comments for the good of the group, we can end this webinar. You guys want to say any last words, or are y'all good?
I think we're all good, but thank you guys so much for the participation.
Yes, and thank you guys for taking your time to present all this information. Just to reiterate, this webinar was recorded, and it will be available on the ACR website. So please email any one of us at ACR or keep an eye on our website, and we'd be happy to provide you with a copy of it. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us today.
All right, thank you.